Hello and welcome everyone. Hello, another VT. Thanks for joining the chat and hanging out and for following the channel. Thanks also to Haffengrim and Skinny D31 for following in the last week. My bitrate is looking solid, so I think, fingers crossed, we are good today. I am using natural light, which is why there's so much glare back here, but I like it for me. The lighting situation for my streams is something I've not reached a place where I'm really happy, because I have these three huge windows and I can either face those windows and get glare like this, or I can have my stuff, have everything away from the windows, right, where the glare would then be on the screens, which would not be great for me. So it mostly works. It'll be fine. Today we are going to do what I wanted to do last week, which is talk about designing adventures and take what I had done and turn it into the first stream of a series, where this week I want to talk about taking an idea from just a little kernel and starting to build it out into an adventure outline and talk about some like story structure elements, but also to show off Bastion of Hope a little bit in terms of a setting, so that the stream that I'm doing here is also generating work that I can then publish and share with folks who are excited about Bastion of Hope as a setting. So Pathfinder PhD asks a great question. When is the Drakkenheim Kickstarter going live? Here is a refresh of the pre-launch page for the Kickstarter, where you can go and check out some initial information. The Kickstarter is going live on Tuesday, November the 4th. I believe it will be in the it will be in the morning or early afternoon Eastern Daylight Time. Ghostfire Gaming is based in Australia, so right, there's some time zone stuff there. I am not really working a lot on the logistical parts of the promotion because Ghostfire has their own like operations folks and producers and things like that, which is great that they have a lot of things already set up. I'm going to be supporting and promoting the Kickstarter as much as I can in my own role as lead designer on the project, and I'll definitely be talking about it here on my streams, but there'll be a lot more to talk about once it's live next week. So I'm very excited about that. I kind of just want to jump forward to next week when the stream is live, but that's not how time works. Thanks, folks, for hanging out, and I'm really glad to see the excitement for the campaign starting up next week. What we're going to do today is talk about designing adventures, and as a reminder, this series and all of the like streaming and design that I do, this is my chronergy, is the most powerful magic. True story, another VT. The stuff I do here is not official for Darrington Press or Critical Role. I'm not speaking on their behalf or kind of in a capacity representing them. I'm just representing myself. We have the kind of the CGL related text here. So now that that is done, we can dive in to the specifics. So I am done with the text work on the Bastion of Hope campaign frame. It is in layout and art is being finalized. Everything I've seen so far looks amazing, and I can't wait to share the finished book with everybody. It will be done hopefully soon, but both Andrew and Sean, the folks I'm working with most directly, are busy folks with a lot of other projects, and I'm really grateful that they've been that they made time to work with me on Bastion of Hope. And so I will have more updates. When I have more updates, I will share them, and I hope it's soon. Bastion of Hope, for those that don't know, is a defiant epic fantasy setting where you play residents of or people fighting for the one free nation in a fantasy world. In this setting, centuries and centuries ago, the gods all signed a non-interference pact and kind of withdrew their influence from this world. In that vacuum of power, dragons who were immortal and have built power and wealth over generations in that first age decided to take over the world in what they call the Great Acquisition. And in the centuries since, they have been the kind of immortal rulers of the world for the most part. But some of these dragons have been deposed or slain by kind of immortal necromancers. So we have like a skeleton queen or an immortal white sorcerer swords person. So the world now is ruled by dragons and necromancers. The setting is very much focused on precarity, solidarity, community versus isolation, and some themes like that, right? In the campaign frame, I have the broader set of themes. The touchstones for Bastion of Hope are things like Dark Sun, Eberron, some of the Final Fantasy games, Exalted, Metaphor Refantasio, Spire the City Must Fall, things like that. When I'm developing settings and things like that, I tend to go with the approach where I take a bunch of inspiration and influences, and then I figure out what makes me excited about all of them, and I take those elements and add my own thoughts to them, as opposed to, I am doing this one thing, but it's my take on it. Both of these are great ways to come up with cool ideas. I just lean toward more of a plurality of touchstones and inspirations in how I do my stuff for the most part. So in this Bastion of Hope setting, I already have my inciting incident kind of adventure hook. What I want to do today is build at least the beginning of my outline for a separate adventure in Bastion of Hope. This will probably end up being either tier 1 or tier 2 adventure in terms of where it lands level-wise. It probably is the smartest to set it at level 1 because people want resources to kind of get themselves started, and if I set it at level 1, I can include a lot of material toward the end that is, here's where you can go from here, which can be really useful. There's stuff like that in the Quick Start adventure, the Saplewood Messengers, which Darrington put out and I was an additional designer on, and I think it's a great way of approaching things. So what I'm going to do here is we're going to go over to my Google Doc where I've got some things, just the very, very barest bit of an initial idea written out. Because what I wanted to do for this stream is show and talk about how I come up with an idea from what I've already developed about a setting, the choices that I make in picking that core concept, and how I take the kernel of an idea and start expanding it out into a larger structure. Here we're building the structure for probably a 5-act adventure that will take most groups 1 to 3 sessions to play, depending on how long their sessions are and kind of what I end up doing with this adventure, right? Because I'm very much starting from almost zero because I want to share the process with everybody here. To begin with, I'm going to restate my objective as I emphasize and highlight it here. I want to convey and explore the themes of Bastion of Hope as a campaign setting. I'm going to put out the campaign frame, and I'm hoping that people will pick it up, play it, engage with it, get excited about it as a setting, because I want to make more material to support people playing in that setting. That is adventures, adversaries, environments, kind of location write-ups for the different realms ruled by the dragons and necromancers, so that people who would like more resources have them, and then count on the fact that the people who want to jump right in just from a campaign frame have what they need there, and then maybe they will dip into some other stuff and grab some things as they are useful. So that's my plan. Where I want to start is the idea of pollution or ecological terrorism and like water safety or water access. because Bastion is a new country, right? It's a new nation. There was a nation there before, but there's all these new organizations and leadership and things. But Bastion is surrounded by enemies. These other nations that are still ruled by dragons and necromancers who want to undermine Bastion and then conquer that territory and add it to their own land. One of the nations that borders Bastion is a industrial kind of magitech focused nation known as the Laboratory or the Laboratory. They are solidly into the beginning of a magitech industrial revolution. So think some of how the mage rite and magic tech works in Eberron, or in some of the Final Fantasy games like Final Fantasy X or 12. Those games maybe more than Final Fantasy VII, which is almost cyberpunk, right? Dystopian science fiction magitech. Here I'm thinking a setting that still feels like fantasy, but there is tech that is magical infused into it. So, we're talking magically powered airships, shields that generate like a magic screen that kind of grows out from the core mechanical piece of shield. A magic wand attached to a larger device to turn it into something that looks like a pistol, that kind of stuff. So that's the vibe. The idea seed is coming from the idea that one of the things I want to be able to do and encourage groups to investigate in Bastion of Hope is the idea that the country itself needs help and that people are going to attack core infrastructure for the nation. The things that a lot of people, especially in developed nations, kind of take for granted, that your water is going to be clean, that if you go to your sink and you turn the tap, there will be water that comes out. And there are places in the world where water access is not a given. And in this setting, I want to explore some of the stories that touch on stuff like that. So the core idea here is you are a group of adventurers who are sent to a town to investigate what's going on because that town's source of water is making people sick, right? Or there's some pollution in the water. And if people do not have reliable access to water, people start dying pretty quick. This is good for a low-level adventurer because it's not as big in scope and scale, but because this is fantasy, it's not just going to be somebody dumped a corpse into the well, right? There's going to be some fantasy element to this. And in my goals, I want to introduce and showcase antagonists from one of these other nations where people are loyal to or subjugated by these the dragon overlords in this case. So we are going to have dragon nation loyalists polluting, poisoning a water source, but in a fantasy way. So what's a fantasy way here? That might be something as overt as like a pollution elemental, right? This is a creature that is an animate clump of pollution. There's a version of this where I could do that is extremely Captain Planet or Fern Gully or something like that. If I go all the way to pollution elemental, I could also have there be that this is like magic industrial runoff from the laboratory nation, right? Where they're doing all this magitech experimentation and they're going to have runoff or like magic industrial waste. And the people in that country might know, oh yeah, this definitely screws with your water supply if it gets into the watershed. And so maybe then they take this runoff, smuggle it over the border between the laboratory and Bastion, and then dump this kind of pollution or toxic runoff in such a way that it gets into the watershed or the water table of this region. That's a kind of a bit more covert approach. And it has a fantasy element in that it's magic runoff, but it's maybe more subtle in a way that makes it different than the pollution elemental approach might be. Things that I want here, right, is I want people to engage with and learn about a town. I want them to care about the people that live in that town. Identify and learn about foes from one of the dragon-ruled nations. Fight some things, people, and reflect on, explore how important core infrastructure is for people's lives. Right? This is not an adventure that is the blacksmith's son has been kidnapped by orcs. Go and rescue him. The Delian Tomb adventure for Draw Steel has that, like, a variation on that really classic somebody from the small town's kid has been kidnapped, go and rescue them. Great setup. I want to do something a little different here. Pathfinder PhD says, I created a natural resource in my game that can be converted into a unique and useful material. The side effect that people are not aware of is that this material saps natural magic from the world, right? That reminds me in a positive way of something like materia from Final Fantasy VII, right? It's this idea that people are extracting something that is useful and has short-term benefits, but long-term detriments, right? This is like mineral extraction. It is peak oil extraction, fossil fuels, things like that. Taking that vibe and bringing it into a fantasy world. I forgot that in previous weeks I had been muting myself when I take a drink. I'm very sorry. I'll try to remember that in the future for this stream. So part one is taking that kernel and beginning to unpack it, right? I'm talking about, what do I want to do? What do I want from this? Some of this becomes scenes, right? There is a fight, can be a whole scene. It might not be a whole act, but it's probably a key element of a scene. Care about the people that live there is not necessarily a scene or an act on its own. It is a objective that I want the adventure to fulfill, right? Engage with and learn about a town. That is a thing that the characters can do as part of the adventure. Identify and learn about foes from one of the dragon-ruled nations, and then fight some people, right? These are probably going to go together. And then the theme of the adventure, or some of the themes of the adventure, I want to then prompt players through their characters to reflect on how core infrastructure like water access and things like that, how important that is to people's lives. The other things that I want to do are showcase cool aspects of the Bastion of Hope setting. Magitech, innate magic, dragon, overlords, PCs as champions of freedom. If this is the first separate adventure that I release about Bastion of Hope, I want it to be a good showcase for what is interesting and cool about the setting of Bastion of Hope, right? This is, I would say that this is just good project management, strategic publishing kinds of stuff. That's how I'm thinking about it here. For taking this and making it more generalizable, not just how am I doing this in specific, but how might I start with a setting and then generate the kernel of an idea to turn into an adventure. What I've done here with this is I looked at the themes that were key in the setting that I wanted to explore, exemplify from Bastion of Hope. And I started thinking to myself, what are some problems that could arise that speak to some of these themes? The questions of the importance of community and kind of the conflict between these different nations, things like that. And the thing that I came to was, what if the water is not safe? And in this, I was inspired by the game Mad as Hell from Soul Muppet. I'm going to find a thing and link it, because I think that game is worth folks looking at. I have the PDF of this. I have not gotten to fully investigate it, but what I've seen from earlier materials makes me pretty excited to check it out. So that's Mad as Hell is the name of the game from Soul Muppet. And the link is in the chat there. I'll try to remember to link it in the description when this comes to YouTube. One of the adventure prompts or concepts that they discuss in, I think, the quick start is the idea that there is some kind of demon polluting the water supply for like an apartment building. The way that Mad as Hell works is that they have literalization of the things that authoritarianism and exploitative capitalism do to people, right? It's not just you don't have clean water. There is a demon representing there isn't clean water, right? And there's kind of some layers to it. And there's a thing where you can fight the symptoms, but then you need to address root causes, which is really cool. So a little bit inspired by that, I took that idea, mishmashed it up with a bunch of other things, and then thought, okay, how could I do something like that in the Bastion of Hope setting? Mad as Hell is urban fantasy with some horror elements. Bastion of Hope is epic fantasy with some like science fantasy, magitech elements, and like strong themes of anti-authoritarianism, community, communalism, things like that, right? This campaign frame is me wearing my politics on my sleeve. If someone comes to Bastion of Hope and they want something that's like, no politics in my fantasy, this is not the thing for you. I try to be clear about the politics of Bastion of Hope without being necessarily super didactic about it, is the goal, right? I want to present a setting that speaks to some things that I care about a lot without necessarily giving a lecture about this is how you should do things. Didacticism has its place. I'm not saying that you shouldn't be didactic. Sometimes people need to learn what's up. But for this, I was taking a different approach. And so to generate an idea, I thought about my kind of businessy or marketing objective for this. And if you are writing adventures just for yourself to use at your own table, the marketing aspect maybe just is not something that matters. But for folks who are watching that are interested in writing and publishing specifically adventures for Daggerheart to then be a commercial offering, that's who I'm maybe most directly or most usefully speaking to here. Hopefully it'll be useful and amusing for other people as well. In your setting, I would say if you are starting from building a campaign frame, this is great because then you can just go to your campaign frame and you can look at your tone and feel, your themes, and then think, what is a story that I could set up for my players or for the groups to engage with that exemplifies or incarnates some of these themes and is set up to generate the emotional experience that fits our tone and feel, right? Bastion of Hope's tone and feel are listed as defiant, heroic, tense, and uplifting. Helping people have safe water again so that they can go back to their lives is uplifting, right? That's the goal, that players should finish this adventure and feel uplifted because they have made this really fundamental material difference in people's lives. It should be heroic because you are fighting against a force or forces or events that are cutting people down, and you are the person who is stepping in and able to address challenges in a way that other people have not been able to. How much I'm conveying defiant and tense, maybe that's a little bit TBD. Defiant, for me, in Bastion of Hope is a little bit more about Bastion versus these other nations. Some of that will come up in having the antagonists from this other country. The tone of or feel of something being tense, I think, is probably going to be conveyed, if it is, in the reality and the dread or despair of people in the town while the water is not safe to drink, right? When the player characters arrive and things are bad and getting worse, then it's tense. So that's kind of my covering the spread on tone. And then on themes, I've already talked about the importance of community, right? One of the essential things that a community of people living together needs is access to clean water. It's really hard to do that without access to clean water, because then people are probably just going to move somewhere else. The other themes are authoritarianism, isolation versus interdependence, and revolution, right? If the water isn't fixed, people might just go off and build smaller communities near a river or something. People will pull away from one another and isolate themselves from one another. Maybe not even intentionally isolate, just a disillusion of a community as people look for places where they can kind of have a better life or have a chance at a decent life. The revolution is a bit broader scale for Bastion. So I'm honing in on mostly that community and isolation versus interdependence element in terms of theme. And I've got a few things in tone and feel that I want to emphasize. And I think that's probably a pretty good place to start that I can feel comfortable in. If I reflect on my touchstones and I think, oh, okay, what other touchstones or what touchstones for this frame could a story like this happen in? I think a story about access to clean water would make perfect sense in Spire the City Must Fall, because we have this like Spire Tower mega city, and where the water flows and who gets clean water, that's got to be a big deal in a huge mega city. So that makes sense. Some kind of magic polluting water could definitely happen in some Final Fantasy stories. I could see this in Eberron because there's also that industrial element. Dark Sun doesn't have the industrialism so much as it has a really strong climate change theme, but access to water is really important there. So I feel like I'm in decent alignment with some of my touchstones. I'm hitting a couple of my themes, and I feel like I'm aligned with my tone and feel. That makes me more confident that I am starting from a good place with this kernel of an idea about magically polluted or compromised source of water for a town. That said, I think I'm ready to start unpacking this a bit more. But if folks have questions about this process of digging into your setting material or your campaign frame to tease something out to turn into adventure, let me know and I'll see if I can talk more or clarify there. And if you have questions about this to ask on the YouTube, please go ahead and do so, and we'll see what I can do. Now I will remember to mute myself. So, next thing is I have these lines already, and I'm going to start to think about a rough sketch of structure. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by talking about fronts, because the topic of fronts has come up in some of my other videos and essays. So for folks that don't know, this is Apocalypse World 2nd edition by D. Vincent Baker and Magay Baker. Apocalypse World 1st edition was a landmark work that is the origin of the Powered by the Apocalypse design tradition. And the number of games influenced by Powered by the Apocalypse that are published, not just games in development, but published, is probably closer to 1,000 than to 100. Incredibly influential initial game and then design tradition that emerged from it, because the way that the 1st edition, especially because that's the one that made that first splash, but the game throughout, the way that it's designed and written is inviting other people to be able to see, understand, analyze, and make their own the design structures of the game, right? Making custom moves is an explicit part of Apocalypse World. Many people have said many things about Apocalypse World. I plan to do a sharing spotlight on it, possibly in this next month, because Apocalypse World is getting a new crowdfunding campaign for Burned Over, which is effectively the 3rd edition. But the thing I'm going to take from Apocalypse World here is we're going to focus on the idea of fronts. And fronts have been used in different ways to different degrees. There is kind of a descendant or something that is echoing fronts in Daggerheart in the long-term, some of the long-term countdowns and how they are used for GMs and some of the advice that goes along with that. But what I want to do here is I'm going to think about the antagonistic force that is making problems in this adventure as a front. Front here is like a storm front, right? You see a storm front coming at you. And so this is a front of pollution, disease, pestilence, right? The thing that is acting on the community in question is in this vibe of pollution, disease, and pestilence. It's less people are coming to kill you and more a force is going to make people sick and destroy communities through disease and like magical illness or something like that. And so when you're building fronts, there's a few different ways of talking about things. The one I'm going to start from is basically what's the bad ending? Or sometimes it's talked about as midnight, or it's the dark future. I'm going to double check what the 2nd edition here says in terms of the end of fronts. If I can find the section on fronts quickly enough. We'll see. Fronts. Da, 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 da. Ba, 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 ba. Threats 108. Countdown clocks. 12. Okay. Can't find it. I'll just talk about it in my own terms. It's fine. This front has an ending in mind. It is pushing toward a particular thing. If the player characters do not interfere and nothing changes in terms of what people who are opposing this front or this force, if they fail, what happens? The end result is the community is dissolved, or the community disintegrates. It's as people die, get ill, flee the town, right? The town in question ceases existing because the illness and sickness is so prevalent and spreads so much that the town ceases existing, right? People move away, people die, the community itself is fractured beyond immediate repair. So that's what this front is driving toward. The forces of antagonism here as expressed in this magic pollution is all driving toward that. The goal for the people doing it is to undermine Bastion and make it susceptible to invasion, because these are people working for the laboratory, right? So the primary actors in this case, if I'm going to make antagonists, right, they are the laboratory saboteurs and then the problems and adversaries that they create, right? Do these saboteurs take the runoff and do some stuff to then create a pollution elemental, so that it's not just them dumping some barrels of stuff? They're doing a more like overtly or recognizably fantasy thing in the region. So, right, the threat right, is pollution, and the people doing it are the saboteurs. So we know their end goal, right? People are so sick that they flee the town. If I was doing a more traditional, sorry, I'm going to scroll down here. Boop, boop, boop. If I were prepping for Apocalypse World, I might do this in a way that is more directly in line with how Apocalypse World works. But because I am drawing on the idea of fronts for Daggerheart, I'm going to do it in more Daggerheart-oriented language. I'm going to scroll down here so that we can stay on target. So this is a countdown to disaster. I'm going to build this countdown. The countdown might not end up actually getting published in the adventure. I am using the structure of a countdown to organize my thinking. And then I will probably draw from that countdown and reference the beats that I generate in plot elements that happen over the course of the adventure. In using a front in this way, my goal is to make it so that the GM understands this is what the adversaries are doing. Here's what they're doing at different steps along the way toward their goal, so that the players can respond in a bunch of different ways, and the GM will hopefully be supported in understanding at least some basic starting information about, okay, if the adversaries have reached this step of their plan and then the heroes intercede, I already know what has happened, so I have a clearer sense of some of the reality of the fiction. Because depending on your thoughts about Daggerheart and what you want from adventures, right, you might want something that is more or less linear. And what I want to try and do here is generate a adventure that is pretty straightforward, but leaves a fair amount of room for players to approach things in their own way, where there are different options and the characters could intercede in different ways at different times. They could get information in different ways at different times, so that there isn't only one possible flow, workflow of actions that the characters can do. So that's why we're going to do a countdown. So in Apocalypse World, midnight is the end, right? Let's call that 12 on the countdown. Normally, countdowns and clocks works differently. Countdowns start high and go to low. Clocks tend to start low and go to high. So I'm going to say midnight is actually 0 here with this countdown. We're counting down towards 0. So this is the town dissolves. People fleeing to find a new place to live. Remaining townsfolk, right? Because by this time, a lot of people will have died, right? Most of the people of the town are deathly ill and others have begun packing up or leaving immediately. Right? What's one step before the town is completely disintegrated and people have left? It's not quite totally disintegrated and people are in the process of leaving. Right? One step before that is many more people become ill and groups begin planning to leave, right? Probably families. Before that, what would need to happen? And some of this, I may end up moving things around, right? At a certain point, businesses are going to close, and businesses will close probably before people leave town entirely, because they won't have the staff to keep the businesses open, but they will hope that things will get better, right? So businesses close should happen before those people leave town, right? Remaining, let's see, I would say most businesses closed, fields empty, more die from the illness, right? I don't think this is a communicable disease. I think this is an illness that comes from exposure to the magic runoff / pollution elemental. So it's not like one person gets sick and they get other people sick. It's more like more and more people get sick. Bionic Panda says rationing of food. Rationing of food is a good idea. I think getting it in there at some point, right? Depending on how I want to play this, one of the things to include later on in the countdown is really active conflict within the community, right? Scapegoating, victim blaming, hoarding, theft, like theft or robbery within the community. The degree to which I emphasize that or don't shifts some of the tonal balance. I think it's probably good to think about where those things would happen. And then if I decide I don't want to emphasize them, I can pull back from it. So if I know where those would go, I can then pull them back if I need to. None of this is me committing to any particular approach. I am slowing down and unpacking my process to try to be more explicit about it so that we can share and talk about how that might work. So fields empty. Let's see. Raids on the richest households. Right. Raids to steal food from the richest households. I could imagine at 2, there's like riots and arson to kind of steal, or basically right, to try to get valuables before leaving town. Order to pay for a new life. Right? Many more people become ill. Families start planning to leave. There's riots and arson as people are trying to steal valuables in order to leave and pay for a new life. Because of my politics, if I include this, I'm going to be as absolutely clear as I can that people only do this when circumstances are completely untenable, right? Most people don't riot because it's fun to riot. Most people don't go and steal food from other people unless it's the only thing that will keep them from kind of malnutrition or starvation. I have very firm beliefs along these lines. This is not the place that I'm interested in debating that, but I am happy to talk about how we might implement and frame some of how we talk about these things. Continuing, right, we're stepping back one step at a time. Okay, before, most businesses are closed, fields are empty, and there are raids with more people dying from the illness. Illness progresses. 10 to 20 people dead. Right, I'm gonna, let's say 25%. Right, okay, how do I measure this, right? Is it percentage of the people that are dead? Is it something else? We're scrolling down here. I'm gonna put my countdown to disaster on this next page so that I can just stay on it. And I don't know that I said so before, but welcome to the chat, Bionic Panda. Thanks for being here. Let's see, violence in the streets as people target scapegoats for the illness. Right? Before you might get this type of scapegoating and violence before you get larger scale riots. Some of this can be flexible. The GM may adjust it in play. Right? When people are scared and hungry, right? When things are really hard, it can be easier to push people toward worse behaviors. If a bunch of people are really scared and you give them something to be angry at, for many people, being angry is preferable to being scared, because you might feel like you have some sense of control if you act on that anger. Let's say that this starts at 10, right? Where 10 is agents from laboratory dump magic runoff into a nearby, let's see, upstream from the town, right? That's the beginning. Somewhere in 8 or 9, pollution elemental attacks people seeking to, people going upstream for clean water, right? The pollution elemental is maybe in the stream/river. The water has already been polluted, and so the well is polluted, right? The town's well is polluted by magic runoff. People begin getting sick. Bionic Panda says, maybe discussions of looking to steal externally also, creating an us versus them before we take from each other. Yeah, right. If this community is more off on its own, then scapegoating of an external community may be more difficult because they're not kind of familiarity breeds contempt, I guess would be the saying that goes along with this. If they're kind of off on their own, people are more likely to, it's harder to blame somebody who's farther away in a useful fashion, because how would they make an impact? The trick here is, of course, that it is people from farther away, these agents from the laboratory. So there's a few different ways of taking that. We have basically 0 through 5, and then we need 6, 7, 8 if we're going to do all of this, right? Probably the player characters are going to arrive at around 7 or 8 in this countdown, where things have already started getting bad. The antagonists have taken some steps and things have progressed, right? People have already started getting sick. The town's well is already polluted. The agents for the laboratory have been here and started the problem. I could probably unpack this even more to right, pollution elemental conjured, right, as part of step 9. And then let's say at 6, the family of some of the sick people blames the illness on the magic of a neighbor. Or blames a neighbor for the illness, calling it a curse. Right? You cursed my kid because XYZQ, right? Somebody interprets what's happening through their own social history and then creates a bad guy. Oh, well, you, my neighbor who is the blacksmith, did this because my nephew who is the cobbler didn't XYZQ, right? We take a local interpersonal social conflict or some history between characters, and this character reframes it as being the source or the cause for this larger problem. The thing that I don't have in here as much is specific characters and the interpersonal dimensions of those characters. I will probably want to get to that point, but if we're starting from structure, I'm probably not going to be able to get there just yet. The first person to get sick dies. More people drink the water and get sick. How much time there is between these different steps, this is also a little variable. I'm not going to treat this as hard material, right? This is a sketch. But what this does is it gives me a sense of where things are going. Player characters arrive here. The town's water has been polluted. People are getting sick, and there is a pollution elemental around. I might even move it to between 7 and 8 so that the pollution elemental has already started attacking. Bionic Panda, you're absolutely on a good kind of track there. To make this more powerful, I'm going to want to develop a cast, right? Who is the first person to get sick? Who are they connected to? What is their role or place within this town? What is this town about? Right? There's a lot of that broader development that will strengthen what I already have and what I'm trying to go for. Because if the player characters show up and what the people who are the locals say is, oh yeah, people are getting sick, that's very different from, oh yeah, well, the mayor's daughter died yesterday and this is what it was like when she was sick. And I heard the trapper, Harry Jim, who's actually like a halfling, right? Not like a simia, right? An ancestry that's actually hairy. I heard Harry Jim say that she got cursed by this medallion that the mayor bought her out in the capital, right? Like complete red herring, but it's the kind of thing that people might say or speculate. And if you can give specifics, if you can put a name and a face on some of these things, you're probably going to be able to get some more emotional impact. When I'm doing stuff like this, my process is very iterative, right? I think some things, I write them down, I revisit it, I change it, I refine it, I reinterpret it, right? This process can be pretty long and involved. I have a lot more experience writing novels and novellas than I do in writing full adventure modules, because as a GM, I have mostly been improv oriented, but the process of generating an adventure and the process of doing prep have a lot of overlap. Writing an adventure for publication, I think, requires a lot more specifics and doing a bunch of things in more detail, because you were wanting to hand over a product that is effectively ready to use without needing to bring as much of your own improvisation or creativity to it. But different people do adventures in different ways. For a Daggerheart adventure, I'm going to want to provide more support for other GMs than I would probably feel like I need if I was just doing this as prep for myself. So that is the standard I'm going to try and hold myself to. And if I were going to focus on this countdown as more of the skeleton of what happens in the plot, I probably would start to seed in specific characters and have individual characters have their own plot lines, right? Where it's like Mayor's daughter, Caressa, let's say, right? Caressa is she, her. 9, Caressa drinks from the well and begins getting sick, right? And then at 7, Caressa dies. And then I might go ahead and try to figure out what happens at 8, right? The mayor brings in the town healer doctor to treat Caressa unsuccessfully, right? So we know some of what the mayor did between when Caressa got sick and when Caressa dies. Maybe I move this so that there is a little bit more space, right? Like, could the player character save Caressa? I don't know. Another thing I'm going to do, especially in the revision process, is I'm going to look at my demographics here. I'm going to go, okay, am I subconsciously or unconsciously making marginalized people the victims in a more stereotypical fashion here, right? The mayor's daughter is the one that got sick. It could be the mayor's son. It could be, how is this different if the first person that dies is somebody of lower social status? Does that mean that the town doesn't go up into high gear as quickly because it was somebody who is lower status and or there's less attention on already? And is that pushing the adventure or the plot line in the direction that I want it to go? Because I would want this to communicate the idea that every life is important, and that, farmers getting sick is a big deal. It's not only a big deal if the mayor's daughter gets sick. Pathfinder PhD says, could there be a potentially reversible zombification as a result of the runoff? Perhaps too much horror. I don't know that I want to go to zombification, but I wonder, could victims get transformed into or generate new pollution elementals, right? If this is, I'm going to go into some bodily functions here, so it may be a little gross. If the way that people are sick is like there's a lot of bodily fluid, right? There's like phlegm and whatever, and that phlegm is magical pollution stuff. Do then people, as their sickness progresses, generate new pollution elementals? So that then when I'm doing my adversary design, I have the big pollution elemental, and then I have little minion pollution elementals, right? Solo, boss versus minion or horde elementals. If there are explicit elementals, that's going to change some of how people talk and think about these things, because they're going to work the reality of what's happening into their theories or into their scapegoating. I think a lot of this could still happen, and people generating elementals or becoming elementals is gross, but in a way that could be interesting, right? I might think back, I might go, okay, how does the idea that this illness that comes from lack of access to clean water turns its victims into more agents that propagate that illness? What does that say if I remove the magical metaphor? And is that thing that basically, am I unintentionally creating or making a bad message, right? The thing I would want to avoid is the idea that, like, if people who get sick because they are morally wrong or bad, right? I don't want that. A sick population creating dangerous enemies could create a quarantine situation, especially in a well-connected town, Bionic Panda says. Absolutely, right? So, quarantine. How do people use their innate magic? Where is the quarantine? Does everyone follow quarantine? Who is treating the sick? So with this, right, Pathfinder PhD and Bionic Panda and other folks are asking questions and making suggestions and and unpacking things. This process of asking yourself questions and then thinking through and incorporating the answers, one, this is very Daggerheart, right? Ask questions and incorporate the answers, but you're doing it for yourself. But if you're asking questions that are the kinds of questions that the player characters may ask, you're also making sure that the material that you're generating is anticipating and can support GMs who will then have the experience of player characters and players asking these questions, which is great. To keep our focus on structure, I want to talk a little bit about some like follow-up moves that the attackers from the laboratory might implement once the player characters get involved, right? If the player characters show up between 9 and 8 and they have a seraph or a druid or somebody or like a wizard with some pretty good healing magic, and right, a knowledge wizard with splendor and healing hands or something else shows up and goes right to the quarantine zone, is like, I want to figure out what this is, and they get a critical on their knowledge roll to analyze what's happening. Okay, what happens there? Right? What's the most that a player character could do pretty quickly? How does that change things? What's likely or pretty common? What are pretty common eventualities that would happen? Right? The PCs can investigate the illness. The PCs can find the pollution elemental. The PCs could track or find the laboratory saboteurs. If the PCs find the saboteurs and incapacitate them and get the whole story about what happened, then the PCs could take that information if things have progressed to like 4, 3, and 2 and say, hey, we know who did this. This was not your neighbors who did this. This is people from this other country that wants to destroy Bastion, right? Maybe they bring the laboratory saboteurs in, as prisoners to show this is what's happening. So if I'm trying to write like a 5-act adventure, there's a certain degree to which what I may want to do is that the 5 acts are both the progression of this front toward disaster, but also the player characters going the opposite way, basically picking things apart and learning the steps of what has been happening and responding to the progression of the bad things that are happening. There shouldn't only be one way to solve the problem, right? The problem is the water here is bad and people are getting sick, and that's going to destroy this community. The player characters can address that in a number of ways, right? Oh, well, I have a thing that will let me create water, or we're going to go up the river and we're going to defeat or kill the pollution elemental. And then once that's done, we're going to do something that's going to like filter out all the bad water, or we're going to do something that gets people more access to clean water. And that means that there's fewer people who are sick and we're going to be able to treat them. So these are the directions in which I would want to continue unpacking things. Because I have had 2 meetings already today, and I have another meeting, and then I have a thing tonight, I'm going to have to pace myself, and I'm probably going to stop this stream, call the stream here. But what I think I can do is keep working on this and post it on Patreon, or I leave this here and I do another stream to continue unpacking this process and share the process along the way with folks so that it's kind of all out there. Next month, I'm also going to be doing streams about the Drakkenheim Daggerheart crowdfunding campaign and campaign guide. So we'll have this other stuff to talk about, and some of that is adventure design. So I'm going to have to figure out how I want to integrate or not integrate stuff from those topics into what I'm doing here. But that is the kind of stuff I'm going to figure out later. I noticed that there was a misspelling here and I wanted to fix it because otherwise it'll bother me. So to recap, I was focused on thinking about tone, theme, and touchstones from my setting to find the kernel of an idea that I could unpack into a plot line and adventure that would investigate, exemplify, display, so on and so forth, those elements from the campaign frame and the setting that I wanted to put front and center. And from that, I kind of listed out and made explicit some of the things, some of the elements I think that this would include or that I wanted to happen. Then I started talking about fronts as kind of inherited through several iterations from Apocalypse World. I talked about how a front takes place, what fronts kind of are, and then built out most of this countdown of the antagonists and what they've done, and then the steps that happen from that, right? I don't have more of what the antagonists do here. And it might be that they are just trying to be pretty hands-off. And if the player characters find them somewhere in here, they're not necessarily stopping this stuff from happening unless they then also do something else, because the damage has already been done, right? The elemental is already loose. The watershed has already been polluted by the runoff. I thought about where the player characters enter, and then we talked some about where NPCs and characters and some of the specific details would come in to take this from a rough concept to being something that is more specific, more detailed, and is more likely to be emotionally impactful, because we put names and faces on things and we think about how characters relate to each other and how they would respond to what's been happening in the adventure. And then I'm going to scroll down a little bit more so I can get to more of these things. In folks in the chat asking questions, they raised things for me to think about, to develop. I started asking myself questions, thinking about what could the player characters do at what stage of the adventure, and how would that impact things. Something that I want to investigate more but have not gotten to do a lot is play more in Carve from Brindlewood. So that is Brindlewood Bay. The Between, Silt Versus, Public Access, and then there's a bunch of games not published by the Gauntlet that are carved from Brindlewood. Brindlewood Bay and like that line, these are all games published by the Gauntlet. These are largely, I think, apologies if not, I think these are all lead designed by Jason Cordova, right? Who owns and runs the Gauntlet. The Carved from Brindlewood story structure is a mystery structure that is very improv driven. The write-ups for these mysteries do not give you the answer of what is happening or what everything comes from. It gives you a lot of puzzle pieces or raw material and clues to fit together on your own for the player characters to gather clues and then theorize about what happened. It's a very different way of approaching storytelling and especially mysteries. It's one that I think is very interesting. I want to engage with it more before I start to try to design within that structure. But as I'm thinking about adventure and module writing, it's something that's on my mind. So I wanted to talk about that at least a little bit and maybe put people on to going and taking a look at that your own self. But now I'm going to come back to refresh and remind everybody of the Dungeons of Drakkenheim Daggerheart Campaign Guide Kickstarter, which is starting a week from yesterday. So that's November the 4th. I will definitely be streaming that week. I might stream on Tuesday, but I'm not going to promise anything just yet because there's still some plans to be made about what all is going to go into promoting that project in terms of what I need to do, right? They're making lots of plans and then I'm going to be involved in some of them. So thank you so much to Bionic Panda, Pathfinder PhD, to Nether VT, Prince Justin, and everybody else who was watching and joining me live. And then a special thank you to folks watching in video on demand on Twitch and YouTube. If you like the stuff that I do and you want to see more of my Daggerheart compatible projects and like homebrew stuff that I have created, then you'll want to go to patreon.com/Michael R. Underwood. And thank you to Not So Simpleton for the stretch. I will definitely be stretching. I will stretch more after the stream. And then I will see you all next week for a stream, probably about the Drakkenheim campaign. Until then, take care.